Have you ever been through this? Have you ever confused control with care, jealousy with love, possessiveness with passion? There are men who say they love you while slowly destroying you, piece by piece, until you no longer recognize the person you were before them. And there are men who never promise anything, who don't always say the right words, but who put their own bodies between you and anything that tries to hurt you, without hesitation, without negotiation, without expecting anything in return. For her, the difference between these two types of men became brutally, undeniably clear on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, when the past she had been running from for 8 months appeared at the door of the bar where she worked. She was cleaning glasses, chatting about nothing important with a regular customer. When she felt it before she saw it, that tightness in her stomach, that chill down her spine, that the body recognizes before the mind fully processes it. And when she turned, there he was, Connor, the man she had loved at 22 and had to flee at 25, the man whose initial charm proved to be a perfect mask for something far darker: obsessive control, pathological jealousy, rage that exploded over increasingly minor reasons, until she could no longer predict which version of him she would wake up with each morning. "Hi, love," he said, as if 8 months of silence and a restraining order didn't exist. As if he had every right to be there, to call her that, to bridge the distance she had placed between them with so much effort and sacrifice. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but she knew that tone. It was the same one he used before the storms, the false tranquility that preceded violence. "Stay with me until the end." Because what happened in those next few minutes will show you something fundamental about the difference between a man who hurts and a man who protects. When she said they had nothing to talk about, that he needed to leave, when she tried to keep her voice steady, even with her heart racing, Connor wouldn't accept it. Of course he wouldn't accept it. Men like him never accept it when they lose control. He crossed the bar in 3 steps and grabbed her arm. It wasn't a touch. It was possession. Fingers digging into muscle. A force that intentionally hurt. The same kind of grip she remembered from bad nights that therapy was still helping her process. "You're mine. You always have been. This little getaway is over. Pack your things. We're going home." It wasn't a request. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command laden with the absolute expectation of obedience that 3 years of relationship had tried to instill in her. And it was precisely at that moment when fear was beginning to paralyze her, when the old voice in her head was starting to whisper, "Just obey. It's easier." Avoid a worse scene that he appeared. Sheriff Jake Dawson. A man she knew only as a customer, who quietly drank beer at the end of his shift, who always paid generously and never caused trouble. But at that moment, he wasn't just a customer. He was an unstoppable force, physically placing himself between her and Connor, forcing Connor to either release her arm or confront authority directly. "Take your hand off her now." 5 words, just 5. But the weight in them, the absolute authority. The certainty that he would be obeyed, the veiled warning of what would happen if he wasn't instantly changed, the entire atmosphere of the bar. It wasn't a shout, it wasn't an empty threat. It was a declaration from a man accustomed to being respected, because respect was earned through actions, not words. And Connor Predator, recognizing larger predator, let go. Not immediately, not without silent resistance from wounded ego, but he let go. And when Jake showed his badge, when he made it clear that this could end with Connor leaving, voluntarily or in handcuffs, Connor chose to leave. But not before giving her a look that promised. Clear as words never spoken. "This isn't over." When the door closed, when the bar returned to the tense silence broken only by murmurs from other patrons processing what they had witnessed, she stood there, processing something far greater than a single incident. Because at that moment, for the first time since meeting Connor, she viscerally understood that she had spent years, 3 full years, confusing possessiveness with love, confusing jealousy with passion, confusing control with care. Connor had shouted that he loved her, while isolating her from friends. He had said he cared while making her question her own sanity. He had promised that everything he did was for her, while systematically destroying the person she was. But Jake hadn't said anything beyond those 5 words. He hadn't made a dramatic declaration. He hadn't asked for anything in return. He simply acted. True protection, she was beginning to understand, doesn't shout. It doesn't demand gratitude. It doesn't use its own heroism as currency to buy control over you later. True protection simply acts placing itself between you and danger. Establishing boundaries you don't have the strength to establish on your own, offering security without attached conditions. And as she looked at Jake, who had returned to his seat, drinking beer as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but whose eyes still periodically checked the door, as if anticipating Connor's return, she understood that the healing journey that had begun 8 months ago was about to take a completely different direction. Because to truly understand what happened in that bar, to understand why that moment was transformative in ways she couldn't even fully process yet, you need to know who she was before Connor destroyed everything. Before Connor, she was different. Not radically. She wasn't a completely different person, but in subtle ways that only those who have been through destructive relationships recognize. She laughed more easily. She made decisions without second-guessing every choice. She had friends she saw regularly. Hobbies she pursued because she enjoyed them, not because her partner approved. At 22, when she met Connor at a friend's party, she was starting her career as a freelance graphic designer, living in a noisy but cheerful shared apartment, planning a future that seemed bright and full of possibilities. Connor was everything she thought she wanted at that time. Charming in a way that seemed genuine, not rehearsed. Thoughtful in ways no one had been before, remembering small details she casually mentioned. Surprising her with romantic gestures, saying exactly the right words at the right moments. In the first few weeks, she felt seen in a way she never had before. In the first few months, she felt loved in a way that seemed cinematic, intense, overwhelming in the best sense. If something like this has ever happened to you, if you've ever met someone who seemed too perfect at first, who made you feel special in intoxicating ways, share in the comments. Because recognizing these patterns can save someone. Because what she didn't understand then, what took her a painful time to recognize, was that Connor wasn't seeing her. He was projecting an idealized version, a version that existed only in his head. And when she inevitably failed to live up to that fantasy, when she showed normal humanity with flaws and needs of her own, he didn't react with understanding. He reacted with frustration that escalated into anger. The transformation was so gradual that she didn't notice until it was too late. It started with suggestions disguised as concern. That friend of yours, the one who drinks too much. I don't know if she's a good influence on you. Then came comments about clothes. You look beautiful, but don't you think that skirt is a little short? I don't want other guys looking at what's mine. Then came questions about where she was, who she was with, why she was. 15 minutes later than expected, coming back from the supermarket. In 12 months, she had distanced herself from most of her friends, not because Connor explicitly forbade it, but because every time she saw someone, there was an interrogation afterward that made socializing too exhausting to be worthwhile. She had stopped accepting certain freelance projects, those that required in-person meetings with male clients, because Connor felt uncomfortable, and she didn't want to deal with the consequences of his discomfort. In 18 months, she had moved into Connor's apartment, a decision he presented as a natural next step, but which she now recognized as an isolation strategy. Because without roommates, without casual witnesses, violence that began as occasional shoves during fights could escalate without fear of interruption or exposure. If this part touched you in any way, if you recognized something in this gradual journey of losing yourself, leave a like so I know you're connected to this story. Because what happened next, the 3 years she spent trapped in a relationship that had become a cage, was a systematic erosion, not only of autonomy, but of identity. Connor didn't need to lock her up physically. He had locked her up psychologically through tactics whose names she only learned later. In therapy, gaslighting, isolation, financial control, intermittent reinforcement that made rare moments of his kindness addictive because they contrasted so sharply with constant cruelty. She stopped working, only temporarily, Connor said, because he was earning well and she deserved a break. But break became dependence. Without her own income, without separate savings, escaping seemed logistically impossible. And Connor constantly reinforced this. Who else would put up with you? Who else would love you with all your problems? Gaslighting so consistent that she began to believe it. She began to think that maybe she was the problem. That if she just behaved better, if she were more understanding, if she tried harder, Connor wouldn't need to get so angry. The physical violence escalated in parallel with psychological destruction. It started with shoves, then came slaps, which he immediately apologized for, crying, saying that she drove him crazy, that he had never lost control like that with anyone, that it was because he loved her too much. Then came punches, kicks, and attempted strangulation that left her unconscious, and that finally awakened her to the reality that next time he could kill her. It was her childhood friend, the only one Connor couldn't completely cut off, who persisted in occasional calls, even when she always had an excuse not to meet who planted the seed. He'll eventually kill you if you don't leave. You know that, right? Harsh but necessary words she needed to hear from someone outside, and something in them penetrated the denial she had built up as a survival mechanism. It took another 6 months of secret planning, hiding money she earned from occasional freelance work she did without Connor's knowledge, researching shelters, restraining orders, resources for victims of domestic violence. And one morning when Connor went to work, she grabbed the backpack she had hidden, put in essential documents and a few belongings, and left. Not to a shelter Connor would know where to look. To a small town 3 hours away where a childhood friend had a cousin who needed a bartender. And if you want to see more stories like this, stories that explore not only trauma, but the journey of healing, of relearning who you are when you are no longer under someone's control, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next 8 months were about rebuilding, about waking up without fear of someone's mood dictating the day, about making decisions, even small ones, like what to eat for breakfast, without calculating whether the choice would provoke a violent reaction, about weekly therapy where she finally began to unpack 3 years of trauma and understand that nothing Connor did was her fault. But healing isn't linear, and trauma leaves scars that don't disappear just because you moved to a different city. She still jumped when the door slammed shut. She still constantly checked over her shoulder. She still had nightmares where Connor found her and dragged her back. And the constant terror was that he would actually find her, that the restraining order document he had already violated by sending messages from different numbers wouldn't be enough, that eventually he would show up. And on a Thursday afternoon, terror materialized. He appeared. And it would have escalated. Connor would have made a worse scene, dragged her out of the bar, done exactly what he had done so many times before, if Jake Dawson hadn't intervened, if he hadn't put his own body up as a barrier, if he hadn't demonstrated, in 5 words in unwavering presence, that true protection doesn't control, it protects. And there's an absolute, fundamental difference between the two that she was finally beginning to understand. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because rebuilding life after an abusive relationship isn't simply about moving to a new city and starting over, as if the past could be erased like a blackboard. It's a daily, exhausting process of reprogramming responses that have been conditioned through years of trauma, of relearning basic truths about oneself that the abuser systematically destroyed, of navigating a world that suddenly seems simultaneously freer and more terrifying than ever. For her, those 8 months since she escaped have been a brutal masterclass in how survival and healing are 2 completely different things, and how you can be doing the former without even beginning the latter. The choice of the small town was strategic in ways only someone fleeing dangerous people understands. Connor always despised places like that, cultural cemeteries, he called them. Places where nothing happens and nobody matters. He dreamed of New York, Los Angeles, cities where he believed his talent as a musician would finally be recognized. Ironically, his ego, his need for a bigger stage, became exactly what protected him, because a small town 3 hours away, with a population of 5,000, 1 bar, 2 restaurants, and 0 nightlife that Connor would consider worthwhile. It was the last place he would think to look. But geographical security didn't translate to peace of mind. She rebuilt her life with meticulousness bordering on obsession, because a single piece out of place, an accidental social media post, a photo where someone tagged her, a careless conversation revealing too much could make everything crumble. Working as a bartender at the only bar in town was a deliberate choice, not because she loved the job, though she was learning to like it, but because it put money into hands Connor couldn't track. Because night shifts meant she slept during the day when nightmares were less intense. Because constant interaction with people forced her to practice socialization that years of isolation had atrophied. The apartment above the laundry room was her first truly private space in adulthood. Tiny bedroom, bathroom, a kitchen that was more of a niche than a real room. Furniture was practically non-existent, a mattress on the floor, 2 folding chairs, cardboard boxes serving as a table, but it was hers, completely hers. No one dictating where she could put things, no explosions because dinner wasn't ready on time, no walking on eggshells calculating every word before speaking to avoid triggering fury. And at 26, she was relearning things that should have been basic, but had become foreign. That she could go out with coworkers after her shift, without asking anyone's permission, without sending her real-time location, without receiving 15 calls in 2 hours, demanding to know exactly who was there and why they were taking so long. That she could wear a dress that showed her shoulders, or tight pants, or literally anything without being interrogated about who she's dressing up for, or accused of seeking attention from other men. That silence in an apartment could simply be peace, not the tense calm before a storm. Not the silent treatment manipulation that Connor used as punishment, but just ... quiet, comfortable, and safe. But freedom came at a price she hadn't fully anticipated. Hypervigilance that was both protection and imprisonment. She compulsively checked her phone, even though she knew Connor didn't have a new number for her. Even though the threatening messages had stopped 3 months ago. She checked windows and doors multiple times before going to sleep. She woke up at any unusual sound, a car passing by, a neighbor climbing stairs, wind banging something against a wall. She avoided posting anything on social media, had deleted most of her accounts, and kept her remaining profiles completely private, with no location, no recognizable photos, no information that could be used to track her. And at work, even in an environment that should have been safe, her body constantly betrayed her. When a client raised their voice, not at her, just chatting animatedly about a football game or politics, she froze. Her breathing became shallow. Her hands began to tremble slightly. Her brain entered a threat assessment mode that therapy called a conditioned, hypervigilant response, but which she experienced as a tsunami of adrenaline disproportionate to the actual situation. Therapy. She went religiously every Thursday morning. 50-minute sessions with a therapist specializing in relationship trauma that a neighboring city offered. There, she was slowly unpacking not only specific events of violence, but the entire psychological structure that Connor had built. Learning vocabulary for things she had experienced but didn't know how to name: gaslighting, intermittent reinforcement, trauma bonding, learned helplessness. Understanding patterns she recognized viscerally, but had never seen mapped clinically. But intellectual understanding didn't erase emotional conditioning. She knew rationally, objectively, that it wasn't her fault. That Connor was an abuser who would have abused any partner because the problem was with him, not her. but part of her, the part that Connor had carefully cultivated through 3 years of manipulation, still whispered doubts. If you hadn't provoked him, ... If you had been more understanding, ... If you had tried harder, ... double quotes. Voices that her therapist helped her dismantle, but which persisted especially in moments of weakness. The healing journey was revealing truths that were both liberating and terrifying. How she had completely lost her sense of self during those years with Connor. Not just interests or friendships, but fundamental aspects of her personality. She used to be decisive. She knew what she wanted. She made choices quickly. But Connor had punished every independent decision until she developed decision paralysis. Unable to choose even trivial things without debilitating anxiety about possible consequences. Reconstruction meant rediscovering preferences that Connor had replaced with his own. What kind of music did she truly enjoy when she wasn't being forced to listen only to what Connor approved of? What food did she prefer when she wasn't cooking exclusively to his tastes? What hobbies would she have had if Connor hadn't ridiculed her every interest as a waste of time or childish? And there was an even deeper issue that therapy was beginning to touch upon, but that she struggled to process. How could she trust her own judgment again? Connor had been so convincing at the beginning. She had completely believed that he loved her, that his jealousy was proof of how much he cared, that his anger was a temporary flaw that their love would overcome. She had ignored red flags that, in retrospect, were glaring: how quickly he wanted her to move in with him, how he isolated her from her support system, how his reactions were always disproportionate. So how would she distinguish a genuinely good man from a predator wearing a mask? How would she know if the attraction she felt was healthy or if it was trauma bonding? Trying to replicate the familiar, even when the familiar was destructive. The therapist said it would take time, that intuition would return as she reconnected with herself, but in the meantime she operated in a mode of total distrust that was isolating in a different way but equally damaging. It was in this context, fragile reconstruction, partial healing, constant hypervigilance, that Connor appeared in that bar. And the impact wasn't just the physical fear that he might hurt her, although that fear was absolutely real and justified. It was the psychological collapse of 8 months of work evaporating instantly, because seeing him even with customers around, even in a public space, reactivated every trauma viscerally. His voice saying hi, love brought back every memory of his tenderness that preceded violence. His hand gripping her arm was a physical replay of hundreds of times he had held her, hurt her, controlled her through force. And when Jake Dawson intervened, when he literally placed himself between her and Connor, when he said with absolute authority, "Take your hand off her now," the revelation that washed over her was transformative in a way that would take days to fully process. Because in 3 years with Connor and 8 months alone, she had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully experienced, what it felt like to have someone protect her without demanding anything in return. Connor always framed everything as protection. Jealousy was because he was protecting their relationship. Isolation was because he was protecting her from bad influences. Control was because he was protecting her from her own bad decisions. But Jake didn't know her. He had no emotional investment. He had no agenda beyond seeing a wrong situation and correcting it. His protection didn't come with strings attached. It didn't come with expectations of performative gratitude or emotional debt. And that purity of action without expectation was so foreign to her experience that she almost didn't know how to process it. In the days that followed that encounter, she would constantly replay the moment, trying to understand not only what Jake did, but what it meant. Because for the first time, she was seeing a different model. She was seeing that true protection doesn't control, it doesn't shout, it doesn't demand reciprocity. It simply acts. It places itself between threat and vulnerable person without calculating personal cost. And this revelation would force her to confront an issue she had avoided since she ran away. Perhaps the problem wasn't that she didn't deserve to be treated well. perhaps the problem was that she had accepted such bad treatment for so long that she had forgotten what good treatment should look like. Comment below. This makes sense to me, because sometimes the greatest healing comes not from being alone, but from finally seeing how you deserved to be treated from the start. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a brutal difference between anticipating a threat theoretically and confronting it when it materializes right in front of you, when the nightmare you've spent 8 months avoiding ceases to be an abstract possibility, and becomes a physical, concrete, undeniable presence in the same space as you. For her, that Thursday afternoon began like any other, the comforting routine of a quiet bar. The slow movement of the period between lunch and happy hour. Superficial conversations with regular customers who had become familiar faces, if not exactly friends. And then the door opened, and everything changed. She felt it before she saw it. It was a visceral, primal reaction that completely bypassed conscious thought. A tightness in her stomach, as if someone had punched her internally. A cold feeling on the back of her neck that made every hair stand on end. Involuntarily holding her breath, her body recognizing danger before her brain could catalog or name the source. She had read about this in therapy, how trauma neurologically changes the way we process threat, how the body develops an alert system that reacts to subtle patterns that consciousness doesn't even fully register. She turned slowly, part of her still hoping, praying that she was wrong, that it was just residual anxiety triggering false alarms. But she wasn't wrong. There he was, Connor, standing in the doorway of the bar. The afternoon sunlight silhouetted behind him, momentarily transforming him into a faceless figure, devoid of detail, just a menacing form blocking the exit. And then he stepped forward, entering completely, and light hit his face. He hadn't changed. 8 months, and he looked exactly like the last day she saw him, when she ran away while he was at work, leaving only a short note saying, "Don't look for me," because a longer explanation would have given him ammunition to argue, manipulate, convince. Same messy brown hair, styled casually, but which she knew he spent 15 minutes every morning fixing. Same strong jaw, same smile that used to completely disarm her, same confident posture that she once found attractive, but now recognized for what it always was. The dangerous arrogance of a man who never learned that no was a valid answer. "Hi, love." His voice cut through the space between them. Casual, as if they were meeting for coffee after a week apart, not 8 months and a restraining order. As if he had every right to be there, to call her that, to act as if time and distance and legal decisions meant nothing. "We need to talk." She didn't answer. Immediately, her brain went into survival mode, processing options at breakneck speed. Other patrons in the bar, 5 in total, all regulars, she knew at least superficially. Witnesses, that was good. Connor was always more cautious in public, less prone to violence when people were watching. Phone in her pants pocket. She could reach it in seconds, call 911, ask for help. Door 10 meters behind her. But to get there, she would have to pass Connor, or go around the bar, and both routes gave him the opportunity to block her. "We have nothing to talk about, Connor." She managed to make her voice sound firm, even though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "You shouldn't be here. You have a restraining order. You need to leave." The transformation in his face was subtle, but she recognized it instantly, his jaw clenching slightly, his eyes hardening even as his smile remained. It was an expression she knew intimately, the one that preceded outbursts, the one that meant he was getting angry but still maintaining superficial control. For now, a restraining order is just a piece of paper. "Love, you know that." He took a step closer. His voice was still calm, almost reasonable, but there was an edge to it now. "And you're mine. You always have been. This little getaway is over. Grab your things, we're going home." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command laden with the absolute expectation of obedience that 3 years of relationship had attempted to instill in her. And what was terrifying wasn't just the words, but the presumption behind them that she would return simply because he ordered it, that her autonomy wasn't a relevant factor, that the decision to leave had never been hers to make. She didn't move. She stood still, clutching the dishcloth she'd been using to wipe glasses, as if it were an unlikely shield. Her heart was still pounding wildly, but something more than fear was beginning to solidify in her chest. Anger, perhaps, or simply rejection. Because she had worked so hard, sacrificed so much, survived so much, only to return now simply because he showed up demanding it. No. One word. Simple, but loaded with the weight of 8 months of therapy, of rebuilding, of relearning that she had the right to say no and be respected. Connor's mask cracked completely. The smile vanished. His eyes turned cold in a way she recognized viscerally, a predator realizing its prey wasn't cooperating, calculating its next move. And then he was moving, crossing the bar in 3 quick steps before she could back away or scream or do anything but freeze. His hand gripped her arm above the elbow. It wasn't a touch, it was possession. Fingers digging into muscle with a force she knew would leave bruises, purple and yellow marks that would take weeks to fade. Physical reminders that no matter how much time had passed, he could still reach her, still hurt her. It was the same kind of grip he used during serious conversations, the same kind that preceded the hospitalization that finally convinced her to run away. "Don't make me repeat myself." His voice was low now, just for her, a veiled but absolutely clear threat. "You either come willingly or I'll carry you. But you're coming." And in that moment, with sharp pain radiating from her arm, with familiar terror flooding her system, a part of her, a small, conditioned part that Connor had carefully cultivated, began to give in. She began to think, it's easier to just obey, cause less of a scene, deal with the consequences later. It was a learned response, honed over years, where resistance always resulted in worse violence. But there was a crucial difference this time. 8 months of therapy had planted seeds of resilience that hadn't existed before. And there were witnesses, clients who had stopped their own conversations, who were now observing with expressions ranging from discomfort to alarm. One of them, Jerry, a regular who always left a generous tip, had pulled out his phone, clearly considering calling the authorities. "Connor, let go." She tried to pull her arm away, but his grip only tightened. "You're hurting me. I should have thought about that before running away like a coward instead of facing problems like an adult." An accusation that made no sense. Was she a problem for leaving an abusive relationship? But which Connor delivered with the absolute conviction of someone who genuinely believed in her own distorted narrative. That's when she saw peripheral movement. Jake Dawson, the sheriff, she knew only as a quiet customer, drinking beer at the end of his shift, had been sitting in the corner. She hadn't even noticed him come in. But he was getting up now, his expression shifting from neutral observation to something more intense, more focused, and he was moving toward them with an unmistakable purpose. Connor noticed it too, turning his head to assess the new threat. But he didn't let go of her arm. If anything, his grip tightened, a declaration of possession that defied intervention. Jake didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't negotiate. He simply placed himself physically between her and Connor, his body blocking Connor's line of sight to her, forcing Connor to choose, let go or confront authority directly. "Take your hand off her now." 5 words, just 5. But the weight in them, absolute authority, a command that wasn't a suggestion, a veiled warning of what would happen if it wasn't a bad, instantly changed the entire atmosphere. It wasn't a shout, it wasn't a dramatic threat. It was the calm declaration of a man who had said those words before, who had enforced them before, who wasn't used to being ignored. Connor hesitated. His hand was still on her arm, but his grip loosened slightly as he assessed the situation. Jake was of similar height, but with broader shoulders, a posture that suggested training and combat experience. And there was a badge that Jake now pulled from his pocket, briefly displaying it. "Sheriff Dawson. And you just violated a restraining order." committed assault in my presence. And you have 3 seconds to release her and leave voluntarily before this becomes a formal arrest. The mental countdown was almost visible. Connor processing the odds, calculating whether it was worth climbing, finally acknowledging that he had lost this round. Ma released her arm with a reluctance bordering on violence. "This isn't over," Connor said, looking over Jake's shoulder, directly at her. "Promise and threat combined. We have history. You can't run from me forever." She's not running away. She's living. A difference you apparently don't understand. Jake didn't move, remaining as a physical barrier. Leaving now, or leaving in handcuffs? Last time I'm offering a choice. Connor chose to leave. But he cast a final look that she felt like physical touch. I promised that this was absolutely not over. That he would return. That he would eventually find a moment when Jake wouldn't be there to intervene. And when the door closed behind him, when the bar erupted in murmurs of patrons processing what they had witnessed, she stood there, her arms still aching, her mind still processing that Connor had been there, had touched her, had threatened to drag her back, and that Jake had stopped him. Simply stopped him. No drama, no violence, just presence and authority. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because to fully understand what happened in that bar, why Jake's intervention was so significant. Why it fundamentally changed not only the situation, but also how she viewed possibilities for protection. You need to know who Jake Dawson was beyond the badge. Because men don't become the protectors they are by accident. It's a combination of experience, deliberate choices, visible and invisible scars that shape who you become when confronted with injustice. Jake had entered the bar 10 minutes before Connor showed up, the end of a shift that had been long and frustrating in ways that were routine but exhausting. At 39, he was at that point in his career where he'd seen enough not to be naive about the system, but not so much that he'd become completely cynical. He still believed his work mattered, that making a difference was possible even when the larger system frequently failed. But believing that cost emotional energy he didn't always have. He just wanted beer and silence. Before returning to the empty house, a 3-bedroom house he'd bought with his ex-wife years ago, which she'd left 7 years before, taking furniture but leaving a ghostly presence in every room that he'd never been able to fully exorcise. At 39, Jake had accepted certain truths about the life he'd chosen. Loneliness was the price of a career that demanded total availability, that didn't respect schedules or personal plans, that turned "I'll be there" into a promise you broke more often than you kept. Serious relationships were complicated when a badge meant that romantic dinners could be interrupted by emergency calls, when you woke up at 3 in the morning to answer calls, when trauma you witnessed daily left you emotionally exhausted in ways that a partner untrained in dealing with it didn't understand. His marriage had failed years ago, precisely because of this. The badge always won over personal commitment, and eventually his ex-wife delivered an ultimatum Jake couldn't accept. It's me or the job. He chose the job. Not because he loved it less, but because he didn't know how to be anything other than a police officer. But solitude didn't mean indifference, Jake observed. It was his job to read body language, detect signs of danger, anticipate problems before they climbed. But it was also simply who he was, even off-duty, even when it wasn't technically his responsibility. Years of training and experience had turned observation into an unconscious reflex. Then he noticed when she, the bartender he'd seen almost daily for the past 3 months since he started frequenting this bar, who had always been polite but maintained a professional distance, who never accepted invitations from customers, even respectful ones, who had the look of someone carrying an invisible weight, froze upon seeing a man enter. It wasn't a normal pause to recognize someone. It was a complete freeze, her whole body stiffening, her breathing visibly changing even from the distance where Jake was sitting. He noticed her body language instantly shifting from relaxed to defensive, shoulders tensing, taking a half step back without seeming conscious of the movement, her hand gripping the cloth she was holding so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Reactions Jake had seen hundreds of times in victims of domestic violence, confronting abusers' conditioned responses, born from repeated experience with trauma. And the man noticed a confidence bordering on arrogance in the way he walked through the bar, the owner of a space he had no right to occupy. The way he spoke to her. Jake couldn't hear the words from where he was, but his tone was clearly authoritarian, demanding, not asking. And then a crucial moment that transformed observation into action, the man grabbed her arm. Jake clearly recognized that he had been dealing with domestic violence cases for years. And it was at the exact moment the situation went from uncomfortable to dangerous. Because there was a difference between a verbal argument, however heated, and physical contact that was clearly non-consensual, designed to control through pain or the threat of pain. That grip, even from a distance, Jake could see his strength, could see her trying to pull her arm away, unsuccessfully crossed a definite line. Jake was standing before, consciously thinking about the decision, his body reacting before his mind had finished processing, training and instinct overriding rational deliberation. Technically, it wasn't official intervention. He was off-duty, not in uniform, his badge tucked in his pocket. And technically, he had no jurisdiction over personal disputes, unless a crime was being committed in his presence. But violating a restraining order, plus physical assault, in a public space absolutely constituted a crime. And even if it didn't, even if it were a legally gray area, Jake had stopped blindly following protocol years ago. He had learned a brutal lesson when he followed procedure exactly, and a woman died because he waited for backup instead of acting immediately. Since then, he operated on a different principle. When he saw injustice happening, when he had the power to intervene, protocol could go to hell. He crossed the bar in 4 long strides, not running, but with a purpose that allowed no hesitation. He calculated his angle of approach. He wanted to place himself between her and the threat, to force the man to deal with Jake instead of her. And when he arrived, when he was close enough to see genuine fear in her eyes, and barely contained anger in his, Jake did exactly what he had planned in seconds. He physically placed himself between them. His presence forced a choice in Connor. Either he released her arm and retreated, or he maintained his grip and confronted Jake directly. And while Connor was clearly a violent man, he was also calculating enough to recognize that Jake's similar height but broader shoulders, a posture that suggested training, an expression that showed neither fear nor hesitation, would not be an easy target. "Take your hand off her now." 5 words that Jake had uttered hundreds of times throughout his career, but their weight never diminished. It wasn't a request, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a command that carried the authority of 15 years of enforcing the law, of a man who wasn't used to being disobeyed, of someone prepared to escalate force if necessary, but preferring not to. Connor hesitated, assessing the situation. Jake could see the calculation at play: go versus self-preservation. The desire to assert dominance versus the realization that fighting a cop in a bar full of witnesses was a bad idea, even for a predator like him. And when Jake pulled out his badge, briefly displaying it, the equation shifted completely. "Sheriff Dawson. And you just violated a restraining order, committed assault in my presence, and you have 3 seconds to release her and leave voluntarily before this becomes a formal arrest." It was a partial bluff. Jake could arrest Connor, but the process would take hours, require her to make a formal statement, and mean an entire night dealing with paperwork, when all Jake wanted was to ensure her immediate safety. But Connor didn't know that, and the threat worked. Hand let go, Connor backed down, left with a final threat, but left nonetheless. And when the door closed, when the bar returned to its collective breath, Jake turned his attention to her. He really looked, not just with professional observation, but with human recognition. He saw the mark already forming on her arm where Connor had grabbed her. He saw her trembling hands as she tried to appear composed. He saw the Herculean effort she was making not to crumble in a bar full of watching customers. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, keeping his voice gentle, a deliberate contrast to the tone he used with Connor. Because he had learned that trauma victims needed to feel in control, needed authority to be reassuring, not intimidating. She nodded, a transparent lie, but one that Jake didn't challenge. Instead, he offered, "You need to file a police report. Violating a restraining order is a serious crime. And this," he gestured to her arm, "is assault. Documenting everything now helps if he comes back." "When he comes back," she corrected, her voice small but firm. "He always comes back." And it was this resignation, not when, but the acceptance that Connor was a perpetual threat, not a solved problem, that made something change in Jake. Because he had seen patterns before. Stalkers, abusers, predators who wouldn't accept losing control, who escalated until something tragic happened or until they were stopped with a force they couldn't ignore. Jake made a decision at that moment that technically violated protocol, but emotionally was the only acceptable option. Connor wasn't going to stop. A restraining order was a piece of paper that a man like that ignored. The system would fail her in the same way it constantly failed its victims. So Jake was going to do something different. "Do you have a safe place to stay?" A simple but weighty question. She hesitated. "My apartment, .. "He clearly knows the location," Jake interrupted. "He needs a place he doesn't know. Temporarily. Until we get him arrested for a serious enough violation that the judge won't release him." And when she tried to refuse, when she said she couldn't ask for that, Jake used the same authority he had used with Connor, but directed differently. "You're not asking, I'm offering. And it's non-negotiable." It was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. But there, in that bar with murmuring witnesses and her still trembling, the foundation was being laid for a connection that would transcend professional protection and become something much more personal, much more complicated, much more real. Comment below. This makes sense to me when someone intervenes not because they have to, but because they can't help but do it. It reveals something fundamental about who they are. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because there is a fundamental difference between witnessing an intervention and fully processing what it means when someone places themselves between you and danger, without hesitation, without calculating the personal cost, without expecting gratitude or reciprocity. For her, standing in that bar with Connor's fingerprints still throbbing in her arm, adrenaline still coursing through her system, with witnesses murmuring and processing what they had just seen, the magnitude of what Jake had done was beginning to solidify in ways that would take days to fully understand. Connor hadn't immediately backed down when Jake approached. Of course, not men like Connor don't give up control easily, especially not when publicly challenged. He'd assessed Jake with a look she knew well, that calculation Connor always made when confronted, measuring strength, searching for weaknesses, deciding whether he could win through intimidation, or if he needed to strategically retreat to regroup. Similar height, Jake's broad shoulders perhaps more impressive than Connor's, a posture that suggested not only physical strength, but training in how to use it effectively. Confidence that came from real experience, not just bravado. But Connor had something that violent men always carry, an irrational belief in their own invincibility. An ego that wouldn't allow them to recognize when they were outmatched, a compulsive need to assert dominance, even when the sensible tactic would be to retreat. "It's none of your business, buddy." Connor tried a casual, dismissive tone, as if Jake were an inconvenient intruder, not a legitimate threat. "This is between me and my girlfriend. Private matter." And it was at that moment that something changed in her. Perhaps it was Jake positioning himself as a physical barrier, creating a safe space where she could speak without immediate fear of retaliation. Perhaps it was the realization that she had witnesses, that Connor couldn't silence her with violence here. Or perhaps it was simply 8 months of therapy, finally solidifying into a moment of courage. "Ex-girlfriend," his voice came out trembling, but firm. A correction that was as much about facts as it was about reclaiming an identity that Connor continued to deny. "And he's not your friend." Jake didn't take his eyes off. Connor didn't turn to look at her. but she saw recognition in his posture, slight adjustment that indicated he had heard that he was registering. She asked you to leave. You didn't. Now I'm asking. It won't be a second time. It wasn't exactly a request. It was a warning, disguised in polite language, a clear line being drawn that Connor could choose to cross, but with explicit consequences. And the tone of calm authority that didn't need to shout because it came from a position of real, non-performative power was so different from how Connor operated that the contrast was glaring even to casual observers. Who the hell do you think you are? Connor took an aggressive step, trying to regain dominance through physical intimidation. It was a tactical error, because Jake didn't back down, didn't move. He simply held his ground with a solidity that made Connor's advance seem childish, a child's tantrum confronting an adult who wasn't going to yield. That's when Jake pulled his badge from his pocket, holding it up briefly so Connor could see clearly. Sheriff Dawson, and you just violated a restraining order, assaulted someone in my presence. And you have 3 seconds to voluntarily leave before this turns into arrest with handcuffs, prosecution, and a night in jail. Your choice. The transformation in Connor's face was immediate and revealing. Anger so visible seconds before was being forced under precarious control, because even a violent man recognizes when antagonizing. Legal authority is a bad idea. It wasn't a change of feeling, just pragmatic calculation. And that was a revelation in itself. Connor could control anger when he wanted to, when there were real consequences, which meant that every time he didn't control it, when he exploded for a trivial reason, it was a choice, not a lack of control. This isn't over, Connor said, looking over Jake's shoulder directly at her. Promise and threat mixed together, words that superficially seemed to be about a relationship but which she heard for what they were. Intimidation. An attempt to maintain psychological control even while losing the physical confrontation. We have history. You can't run from me forever. She's not running away. She's living. Jake corrected, his words cutting through Connor's narrative with surgical precision. A difference you apparently don't understand. A half step forward, invading Connor's personal space. A clear demonstration that Jake was neither intimidated nor impressed. Leaving now, or leaving in handcuffs. There won't be a third option. Connor chose to leave, but he did so with a palpable reluctance. With a final look, he cast at her that promise clear, as if he had spoken it aloud, that this was absolutely not over. That he would return, that he would eventually find a moment when Jake wouldn't be there to intervene, and that there would be consequences for her having publicly embarrassed him. When the door closed behind him, when Connor disappeared down the street, leaving only residual tension and murmurs of patrons processing the drama they had witnessed. The bar seemed simultaneously safer and more fragile. Safe because the immediate threat was gone. Fragile because she knew everyone knew that this was a pause, not a resolution. Jake turned to her, a deliberate movement that gave her time to compose herself minimally if she wanted to. And when she looked, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Not pity, not judgment, but recognition. As if he had seen situations like this before, knew the pattern, understood the dynamics, without her needing to explain. Are you okay? A simple but weighty question. And the tone gentle, unhurried, a stark contrast to the authority she used with Connor made. Something inside her cracked slightly. She nodded. An automatic response they both knew was a lie. She wasn't okay. She was processing that Connor had found her despite all precautions, that he had touched her, that he would have dragged her away if Jake hadn't intervened. Her hands were still trembling as she tried to appear composed for the onlookers. The red mark on her arm where Connor had grabbed her was already beginning to darken into a bruise that would take weeks to disappear. Her eyes were moist, but without tears, because she had learned long ago not to cry, not to show the vulnerability that Connor always used as ammunition against her. Thank you. The words sounded inadequate for the magnitude of what Jake had done. For intervening. You didn't need to do that. I needed to. Jake corrected gently. I couldn't not do it. And you don't need to thank someone for doing the right thing. He kept a respectful distance, not invading her space, aware that she had just had her autonomy violated, and probably didn't want physical proximity, even from a protector. But you need to file a police report. Violation of a restraining order is a serious crime. And this, he gestured to her arm, is assault. Documenting everything now builds a case, if he comes back. When he comes back, she corrected, echoing the certainty she had expressed earlier. He always comes back. A restraining order has never stopped him before. And it was this resignation, not an if, but a when. An acceptance that Connor was a perpetual threat, not a solvable problem, that changed something in Jake's expression. His jaw clenched slightly. His eyes became more determined, because he had seen this pattern hundreds of times. Victim trapped in a cycle where the abuser always returns, always escalates. The system always fails until tragedy strikes. Then let's do it differently this time. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration of intent. Do you have a safe place to stay? A place he doesn't know? Her hesitation was answer enough. My apartment, ... but he probably knows where it is. Then we need an alternative, temporarily, until we get Connor arrested for a serious enough violation that the judge won't release him on bail. Jake was already formulating a plan, his mind operating in problem-solving mode that his career had honed. I know of a safe house in a neighboring town, or ... double quotes no. The answer came out more vehement than she intended. Connor knows about shelters. I tried using one when I first left. He showed up there too. They're the first place men like that look. Jake nodded, validating her concern without dismissing it. Then my house, guest room, private property with no public record connecting it to you. He won't think to look there. I can't ask that, ... She's not asking. I'm offering authority again, but directed toward protecting, not controlling, and it's non-negotiable. Connor proved today that she knows where you work. She probably knows where you live. Being alone is a risk you don't need to take when there's an alternative. And it was at that moment, with Jake offering protection without demanding anything in return, without hinting at any hidden motive, without making her feel indebted or obligated, that she began to understand, truly understand the fundamental difference between a man who says he loves her, but hurts her, and a man who doesn't even know her, but acts to protect her. Connor always framed everything in terms of love. Jealousy was because he loved too much. Control was because he cared. Violence was because she provoked him to the point where love turned to anger. But Jake didn't mention love, didn't make declarations about feelings, didn't try to create emotional obligation. He simply saw the wrong situation and corrected it. He saw someone in danger and offered safety. No strings attached, no expectations, no agenda beyond doing the right thing. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because there's a specific type of terror that doesn't come from a single, violent attack, but from constant stalking, from a presence that never completely goes away, from understanding that no matter where you go or what you do, someone is always watching, always waiting, always reminding you that you're not really safe. For her, the days following the confrontation at the bar turned into a brutal masterclass on how a determined predator operates. Not through immediate violence that could result in imprisonment, but through a systematic, psychological campaign designed to destroy any sense of security she had so carefully rebuilt. Connor didn't stop. Of course, he didn't stop men like him, never. Stop voluntarily, never accept loss of control, never respect boundaries set by others. Retreating at the bar had been a tactic, not defeat. And he began the next phase of his campaign with a speed that suggested planning, not impulsive reaction. First came the messages. Her phone rang at 11 o'clock at night, 2 days after the confrontation. A number she didn't recognize, not Connor, not anyone in her contacts. Instinct told her to ignore it. But what if it was an emergency? What if it was work? So she answered. Silence on the other end. Breathing, perhaps. Or perhaps just static. Then his voice. Hi, love. I missed you. She hung up immediately. Blocked the number, her hands trembling violently. 20 minutes later, a text message from a different number. Sorry for losing control at the bar. You made me nervous showing up with another guy like that. I just want to talk. Let's work things out like adults. As if she were the problem for having protection. As if Connor were a victim of a non-aggressor circumstance, violating a restraining order. She didn't reply. She blocked that number, too. But Connor had an apparently endless supply. Messages kept arriving from new numbers, text apps, disposable accounts, methods that made blocking useless. And the tone escalated predictably. You can't ignore me forever. Then, remember how good things were between us. We can have that again if you just stop being stubborn. And finally, a veiled threat becoming explicit. You think Sheriff will always be there. Eventually, she'll be alone. And we'll have our talk. I promise. The impact wasn't just words, but consistency. Messages arriving at random times, 3 in the morning, noon, during dinner. There was no pattern she could anticipate, no safe period where she could relax. It was a form of psychological torture that Connor had refined during their relationship, keeping her in a constant state of alert, never allowing her to feel completely safe. She showed Jake messages when he showed up at the bar 2 days after the initial confrontation. He had framed a visit as following up on the case, professional verification of a witness and victim. But the timing exactly when her shift ended. As if he had memorized the time and the way his eyes thoroughly scanned her. Looking for signs of injury or distress, suggested the motivation was more personal than he admitted. Jake meticulously documented everything. He photographed every message. He noted the timestamps. He added them to the growing police report. He used the evidence to obtain an expanded restraining order that included specific provisions against contact via electronic means. But they both knew that paper, however official, however legally binding, couldn't stop a man who had already demonstrated complete disregard for court orders. And Connor proved this immediately through an even more insidious tactic. Physical stalking that operated precisely within legal lines while completely violating the spirit of protection. He began showing up in places where she was. Not approaching, not speaking, just ... present. It was Wednesday morning at the supermarket. She was choosing products when she felt that familiar sensation being watched. She turned, checked the aisles. Nothing. She continued shopping. In the dairy section, she saw his reflection in a freezer door. Standing 3 aisles back, pretending to study cereals but looking directly at her. When she turned completely, he waved. Small, casual, as if the encounter were a happy coincidence. She abandoned her cart and left immediately. Mail, on Friday. She went to pick up the package. Connor was in the parking lot, leaning against his car, waiting. Not blocking her path, not technically violating any order, just there, watching. When she ran past to her own car, he shouted, "What a coincidence, huh? Small town." A casual tone that didn't disguise the threat. And outside her building. Several times. Parked across the street, always a safe distance but always visible if she looked out the window. The message was clear. I know where you live. I can be here whenever I want. You're not safe. It was psychological stalking that the law had immense difficulty prosecuting because Connor was careful never to get close enough to constitute a technical violation of an order. I was just shopping. I was just picking up mail. The parking lot is public. I can be wherever I want. Always a plausible excuse. Always a denial of intent. Always framing her as paranoid if she reported it. But the impact was devastating. The peace she had built up over the past 8 months had completely evaporated. I couldn't go anywhere without constantly checking over my shoulder. I couldn't relax in my own apartment, knowing that Connor might be out there, watching. Sleep already precarious became almost impossible. I ate poorly. I lost weight. Dark circles under my eyes became permanent. The therapist increased the frequency of sessions, recognizing that she was regressing. That trauma they had worked to process was being reactivated in real time. But therapy could only do so much when the threat was not a memory, but a continuous present. It was Jake who noticed the deterioration first. A week after the stalking began, he walked into the bar and immediately saw that something was wrong. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her hands trembled constantly now, not just when she was scared. Her eyes compulsively checked the door every time she opened it. She was operating in pure survival mode, which was unsustainable. "We need to talk," Jake said, his tone not allowing for discussion. He waited until her shift ended, then took her to the police station, an official space where they could talk without interruption. And when she began to recount the stalking, when she admitted that she hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night since Connor started showing up, Jake made a decision he had avoided because it crossed professional lines, but which now seemed the only viable option. "You're going to stay at my house, guest room, temporarily, until we get Connor arrested for a serious enough violation that the judge won't release him on bail this time." She tried to refuse immediately. "Jake, no. You've already done too much. I can't ask this of you. It's not your responsibility. ... You're not asking. I'm offering." He interrupted with a firmness that wasn't anger but absolute determination. "And it's non-negotiable. Connor has proven he knows where you live, where you work, where you go. My house. Private property with no public connection to you. An address he won't easily find. And more importantly, a place where I can guarantee he won't get near you. That's too much. To cross paths with someone like that. ... My life was already intertwined the moment I intervened at the bar." Jake was brutally honest. "I can't undo this. And honestly, I don't want to, because leaving you to face this alone when I have the ability to help isn't an option I can live with." She processed the words, searching for hidden manipulation, the agenda Connor would always have. But all she saw was sincerity, genuine concern, without strings attached. For how long? For as long as it takes. A week. A month. Until the situation is truly resolved. Not just temporarily suppressed. Pause. "Look, I know it's strange. I know we cross paths with acquaintances too quickly. But Connor isn't giving us time to do this gradually. He's forcing decisions now. And the decision I need him to make is, do I trust him enough to accept help?" That was the question that cut to the core. Because trust had been so completely destroyed by Connor that rebuilding seemed impossible. But Jake had proven through actions, not words, not promises, but concrete actions that protecting him didn't come at a hidden cost. "Okay." The word came out small but firm, but only temporarily. "And I pay rent ... double quotes, no." Cut to the chase. "I'm not being a landlord. I'm being someone who helps. There's a difference. You contribute with groceries if you want. You cook if you're inclined. But this isn't a commercial transaction. It's one person helping another because it's the right thing to do." And it was in this distinction. Jake, refusing to frame it as a business transaction, insisting on maintaining it as a human act of protection, that she understood something fundamental. The authority Jake exercised was completely different from the control Connor always used. Jake established boundaries to protect, not to dominate. He made decisions not to take away her agency, but to create space where she could reclaim the agency Connor had stolen. Connor always disguised his control as love. Jake never even mentioned love, only acting with a care that was more genuine than any declaration Connor ever made. Comment below. This makes sense to me when someone protects you without demanding. Gratitude, without making you feel indebted. That's when you know it's real. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a specific moment in any police officer's career where you have to confront an uncomfortable truth. The distinction between doing the job correctly and doing what is morally necessary doesn't always align perfectly. and sometimes choosing the latter means sacrificing the former. For Jake, that decision to bring her home wasn't a heroic impulse or a romantic gesture, it was cold calculation about systemic flaws he knew all too intimately. Combined with a growing recognition that she had become more than just a victim on a report. And that combination was precisely what made the situation so complicated. Jake knew he was crossing lines, not just stepping on them, but deliberately trespassing into territory that training manuals specifically warned against. Bringing a witness victim into a personal residence was not standard protocol under any circumstances. It was personal involvement that superiors would question if they found out, that a defense attorney would use to discredit if it went to trial. Sheriff Dawson had an inappropriate relationship with the alleged victim, compromising his objectivity and making his testimony suspect. And Jake himself would have criticized this in another police officer years ago, when he still believed that professional distance was always appropriate, always possible, always superior to personal involvement, when he still operated under the illusion that you could protect everyone equally just by following procedure, that the system worked if you operated it correctly, that crossing the line between professional and personal inevitably compromised both. But years of experience had eroded certainty. Jake had seen too much victims who followed protocol perfectly and died anyway because the system was slow, because restraining orders were just paperwork, not protection, because shelters had limited capacity and determined stalkers had unlimited time. He had responded to calls where he arrived minutes too late, where a woman he had counseled just 2 weeks earlier was dead because protocol didn't accommodate the urgency of her specific situation. And Connor wasn't a common threat that standard protocols were designed to handle. He was a specific, focused predator who had demonstrated tactical intelligence in how he operated, always technically within legal lines, while completely violating the spirit of protection. A man like that wouldn't be stopped by restraining orders or increased patrols or any other conventional measure the department could offer. He would only be stopped through intervention that anticipated his movements, that outmaneuvered him in dedication and resources. And she wasn't just a victim on paper. Jake had begun to know her not deeply, not extensively, but enough to see the real person beneath the trauma. Through brief conversations at the bar, when he stopped after his shift, when she occasionally commented on a book she was reading or music playing, moments of humanity that pierced her cautious reserve. Through the process of filling out police reports, where her courage in continuing despite violently trembling hands impressed him more than he expected. Through the way she continued to live working, paying bills, showing up for therapy, when it would have been much easier to completely crumble under the weight of renewed trauma. Jake saw something familiar in her, a survivor trying to rebuild her life piece by piece, while the past constantly tried to drag her back into the abyss she had escaped. And he wasn't going to let that happen. Not when he had the power to stop it. Not when his intervention could make the difference between her surviving and becoming just another statistic in a closed case file. But justifying a decision professionally was one thing. Processing personal motivations was something completely different. And at night, with her sleeping in the next room, door closed, space respected, boundaries maintained, Jake faced a truth he had avoided during the day when he could distract himself with work and responsibilities. He wasn't doing this just out of duty. He was doing it because she mattered. In a way that completely transcended professional roles. In a way that he had begun to recognize in carefree moments, the genuine concern when she didn't show up at the bar at the usual time, the disproportionate relief when he saw that she was okay. The anger he felt when he thought about Connor touching her, hurting her, scaring her. Because the idea of Connor catching her, not theoretically but viscerally. Imagining a concrete scenario where stalking escalated to physical violence. Where Jake arrived too late, where she became a body at a crime scene instead of a person talking to him, was deeply personally intolerable and had nothing to do with a badge. Jake had seen domestic violence lead to homicide many times. He knew the statistics: women in abusive relationships are 75% more likely to be killed when they leave their abuser. The most dangerous period is the first few months after separation. Stalkers who escalate to trespassing have an extremely high probability of escalating to lethal violence. Numbers weren't abstract to Jake. They were faces, names, cases he prosecuted, funerals he had attended. And projecting those statistics onto her specifically, imagining her face in a crime scene photo, her name in an obituary, his report documenting that he followed protocol perfectly but still failed to keep her alive, generated a reaction that was pure, visceral, unacceptable. This complicated everything. Because how do you objectively protect someone when every decision is charged with emotion that grows daily? How do you maintain professional distance when the person is literally sleeping in the next room? How do you separate duty from desire when the lines between the two become increasingly blurred? Jake didn't have the answers, but he had discipline born of years of service, so he established strict boundaries, not for her, but for himself. He didn't enter her room without explicit invitation. He didn't touch her beyond what was functionally necessary. He kept conversations relatively superficial, avoiding intimacy that would make an already complicated situation impossible to navigate professionally. But discipline only worked when minimally tested. Living in close proximity, sharing space, couldn't avoid moments that cracked the resolve. When she woke from a nightmare at 3 a.m. and he listened through the wall, hearing her cry but respecting her privacy even when everything in him wanted to offer comfort. When she cooked dinner as a way to contribute and they ate together, conversations gradually shifting from transactional to personal. When she made a joke, rare but genuine, and the laughter it provoked in him felt different from any laughter he had experienced in years. And Jake began to recognize symptoms in himself that he had seen in others. Symptoms that he had always advised against: thinking about her at random times during the day, checking his phone more frequently in case she needed him, finding excuses to come home earlier, feeling less empty at home in a way that was comforting, but also terrifying, because Jake knew where that led. He had seen colleagues become involved with victims they protected, seen how it invariably ended either in relationships built on an unstable foundation of trauma and gratitude that eventually crumbled, or in boundaries so violated that cases were compromised and careers ended. But intellectual knowledge didn't change emotional reality. It mattered. And the more time passed, the more he got to know her, not the traumatized version Connor had created, but the person she was slowly becoming again in a safe environment. The more impossible it was to pretend that this was merely a professional duty. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because proximity forced by circumstance has a unique way of revealing truths that people normally keep hidden, not through grand confessions, but through the accumulation of small moments, accidental vulnerabilities, humanity that slips out when defenses are too low to constantly maintain. For Jake and her, those first days living under the same roof were a masterclass in how to people who have built entire lives. Avoiding true intimacy can, when thrown together by necessity, slowly and carefully begin to let themselves be seen. The days acquired a rhythm that was simultaneously strange and comforting. She woke up early, a habit from years working in a bar, her body programmed for a schedule even when she wasn't on a shift. She went down to the kitchen expecting to be alone, only to find Jake already there, coffee made, sitting at the table with reports scattered around, working on cases in the early hours, because he wasn't sleeping well either. The first mornings were awkward, murmured good mornings, careful movements, so as not to invade each other's space. A keen awareness of the forced intimacy of sharing domestic space. But she had a compulsive need to contribute, to not just be a burden or a passive victim occupying his space without giving anything in return. So she started cooking. Not because Jake asked, he would never ask, always conscious of not creating obligations, but because she needed to do something useful, to create something with her own hands when so much was out of control. At first, it was just a simple breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice. But she noticed how much Jake appreciated it, not just the food, but the act of someone preparing a meal for him. A small domestic gesture his home hadn't seen in years. Then dinners began, too. Nothing elaborate initially, just simple pasta or roast chicken. But gradually, as she relaxed even slightly, as Jake's kitchen became familiar territory instead of foreign, meals became more complex, more personal. Dishes she used to make before Connor, before losing parts of herself. And Jake appreciated it in ways that went beyond simply liking food. It was seeing her do something beyond surviving, something that was a choice, not a necessity. Something that suggested she was just beginning, to reclaim the agency Connor had stolen. It was sitting at the table with someone instead of eating alone in front of the TV. It was home feeling less empty in ways that were comforting, but also slightly terrifying, because it meant he was getting used to her presence. Conversations during dinners started superficially about how the day was, the weather, nothing important. Both maintained a safe distance, avoiding topics that could create dangerous intimacy. But it's impossible to maintain superficiality indefinitely when you share space. When you see someone in moments that aren't shared, when the accumulation of days creates a familiarity that erodes reserve. She was the one who delved deeper first. Perhaps because therapy had taught her the value of verbalizing trauma. Or perhaps because the relative safety of Jake's home was allowing her to process things she had compartmentalized for survival. One night, after a particularly quiet dinner, she began to talk about Connor. Not just the physical violence that Jake already knew about through reports, but the psychological destruction that he had no way of officially documenting. He isolated me so gradually that I didn't even realize it was happening, she said, looking at her empty plate instead of Jake. It started with casual comments about friends. That friend of yours drinks too much. She's not a good influence. That guy was always flirting with you. I don't like you hanging out with him. And because it seemed to come from a place of care, of protection, I listened. I canceled plans. I distanced myself from people. Until one day I looked around and realized I had no one but him. No one to call when things got bad. No one who would notice if I disappeared. Jake listened, without interrupting, recognizing that she needed this to get out, that there was therapeutic value in being heard without judgment. And worse than physical isolation was how he made me question everything. My judgment, my perception of reality. Her voice grew firmer, anger beginning to seep into the pain. He denied things I knew I'd seen. He twisted conversations to make it seem like I'd misunderstood. He convinced me I was being irrational, overly emotional, that if I just behaved better, if I was more understanding, he wouldn't need to get so angry. And eventually I started to believe it. I started to think that maybe I was the problem, that no one else would put up with me, that I should be grateful he stayed. Why did you stay so long? Jake asked when she paused. It wasn't an accusation. Her tone was gentle, genuinely trying to understand dynamics that reports never fully captured. Because he didn't start out violent. The answer was almost a whisper. He started out charming, attentive in ways no one had ever been. He made me feel special, seen, loved. And when the first signs of control appeared, I rationalized. He just cares. He just wants to protect me. Every relationship has adjustments, and the change was so gradual, month by month, line by line, being crossed, that when I finally recognized the pattern, I was already trapped. Financially, because I had stopped working. Emotionally, because he had convinced me that I was worthless without him. And physically, because attempts to leave resulted in violence that terrified me back into submission. Her voice broke at the last word. Jake saw tears welling up, saw her struggling to control them because crying was a vulnerability Connor had always used against her. It wasn't your fault, he said, firm but gentle. Nothing you did justified what he did. He chose to abuse. He chose to manipulate. He chose to violate. Those were his choices. not your failings. These were words her therapist had spoken. Words she intellectually knew to be true, but emotionally struggled to internalize. But hearing them from Jake, a man who had seen countless cases, who knew patterns intimately, who had no reason to lie to make her feel better, carried a different weight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing. For not making me feel stupid. You're not stupid. You're a survivor. There's a huge difference." And after that night, something changed. She began to share more, not just about Connor, but about who she was before, who she was trying to become again. Interests that Connor had ridiculed, and that she was slowly reclaiming. Dreams she had abandoned, and was considering resurrecting. The person who existed beyond trauma. And Jake, seeing her vulnerability, found himself reciprocating in ways that surprised him. Sharing not only about their failed marriage, a fact she already knew, but about how it had failed. "I prioritized Badge above everything," he admitted one night while they washed dishes together. A domestic ritual that had become comfortable. Every time she needed me and work called, I chose work. Every time. And I justified it as lives are at stake, or it's my duty. But the truth was, Badge was easier than relationship. Protocol told me exactly what to do. Relationship required emotional navigation, which I wasn't good at. So, I hid behind work until she gave up competing with it. "Do you regret it?" Her question was gentle, without judgment. "Every day. Not because I'm a police officer, that's who I am. But because I haven't learned to balance things. Because I've let loneliness become comfortable, because it avoided the risk of hurting or being hurt again." He paused, considering how much more to reveal. "After she left, I built walls. Easier to maintain than relationships. And it worked for years. Until you." The silence that followed was heavy. "Even me, what? Until you make me question whether walls are worth the price they charge." It was the closest Jake ever came to admitting that his feelings had crossed from professional to personal. And she heard, really heard, not just words, but implication. "I have walls too," she admitted. "Connor taught me that vulnerability was a weapon against me, so I stopped being vulnerable. I became small, closed off, inaccessible. And after I ran away, the walls got even higher because I needed to survive alone. But being here, with you, is making me question whether I'm protecting myself or imprisoning myself." Mutual vulnerability created a connection that neither had planned, but both had come to value. And through days of closeness, shared meals, conversations that drifted into increasingly personal territory, small moments of mutual care, something was growing, fragile but real, complicated but undeniable. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Sometimes true connection is born not from grand moments, but from the accumulation of small acts of vulnerability and care. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific moment in any trauma story where the predator forces a final confrontation. Not because he is confident of winning, but because he is losing control. And desperation makes dangerous men even more unpredictable. Even more willing to escalate to violence that they previously only threatened. For Connor, that moment arrived 2 weeks after she moved into Jake's house. 2 weeks of frustrated stalking where he couldn't reach her. 2 weeks of anger simmering until it exploded in a decision that would irreversibly change everything. Connor's behavioral transformation during those 2 weeks was both predictable and terrifying. Jake had seen patterns before in stalkers when they realize their victim is genuinely out of reach. Progressive escalation of tactics, increasingly desperate attempts to regain control. First, there were more frequent, more virulent messages. Then there were attempts to contact her through third parties, Connor calling the bar where she worked, pretending to be a customer, trying to find out if she was still in town. Then there were increasingly bold appearances near places she used to frequent, testing whether she still followed old routines. But she wasn't following. She wasn't at her apartment. She wasn't working regular shifts at the bar. She'd requested temporary leave, which her boss understood given the circumstances. She wasn't anywhere Connor could predict or access. And this inaccessibility, this complete loss of control, was clearly destroying his already fragile sanity. Jake saw signs of imminent escalation, messages becoming more incoherent, more threatening. Connor showing up drunk outside the police station one night, yelling about how Jake had stolen her, how he was going to get back what was his. Behavior that should have resulted in arrest, but which Connor managed to evade by arguing that he was merely exercising his right to free speech, that he hadn't technically violated any order because he hadn't approached her directly. He's going to do something stupid, Jake told her 3 days before the invasion. Men like Connor, when they realize they've lost, don't retreat peacefully. They escalate, and when they escalate, someone usually gets hurt. She knew. Her body knew before her mind fully processed it. Nightmares intensified, no longer just memories of past violence, but anticipatory anxiety about future violence. She would wake up sweating, her heart racing, convinced she heard Connor breaking in, only to realize it was the wind or a water pipe or Jake moving around in his own room. And then it arrived. 3 a.m. on a Wednesday, 2 weeks and 3 days after she moved in. The sound of breaking glass, loud, unmistakable, coming from the back of the house. Jake woke instantly. Training. Taking over before consciousness fully processed. Gun on the bedside table, moving before thinking. Adrenaline flooding his system. Police. Identify yourself. An automatic shout as he descended the stairs, positioning his body between her bedroom on the 2nd floor and the threat on the 1st. And then he saw a figure climbing through a broken kitchen window. The awkward movement of someone intoxicated but determined. He recognized the silhouette immediately. Connor. She's mine. Connor shouted, his voice slurred but his anger perfectly clear. Where did you hide her? Where is my girlfriend? On the ground, now. Jake held his weapon high, steady despite his racing heartbeat. He could see that Connor had something in his hand, an oblong shape, a reflection of glass. A bottle breaking at the entrance, creating an improvised weapon. Last warning. On the ground or I'll shoot. Connor disobeyed. Of course, he disobeyed in intoxication and anger overriding self-preservation, his ego, preventing him from backing down. You have no right. She's mine. You stole her from me. I'll get her back, even if I have to step over you. He moved forward, stumbling, but coming, shouting her name now. Love, I know you're here. We need to talk. Just talk. Jake had a split second to decide. Shooting would be justified, an intruder on property, armed, threatening, advancing after multiple warnings. But part of Jake, the part that still operated as a police officer, even in a moment of absolute adrenaline, processed that Connor was holding a bottle, not a firearm, that he was stumbling, not carrying with coordination, that killing him would create legal and emotional complications that would haunt everyone involved. So he decided differently. He holstered his weapon, calculated the timing, and when Connor was close enough, he struck. A technique he had practiced hundreds of times in training, moving low and fast, his shoulders striking Connor's center of gravity, bringing them both to the ground with a force that took their breath away. Connor didn't give up easily. He fought with a force fueled by intoxication and desperation, punching savagely, trying to bite. A broken bottle still in his hand, cutting dangerously through the air. Jake blocked, redirected, used his weight to subdue him, but not without cost. Glass caught his arm, a deep cut that immediately began to gush blood. Sharp pain, but Jake ignored it, focusing only on controlling the threat. He managed to turn Connor around, force his arms behind his back, handcuffed him with the metal he carried even off-duty. Connor was still screaming, still fighting, but now restrained. You don't understand. She needs me. Without me, she's nothing. Nothing. Jake called dispatch, his voice surprisingly calm given the circumstances. 10:56. Trespassing at Sheriff Dawson's residence. Suspect arrested. Backup needed. Then, quieter, and ambulance. Cut on the arm. Backup arrived within minutes. Officers who knew Jake, who quickly processed the scene and took custody of Connor. Paramedics treated the cut, requiring 14 stitches, but nothing permanently damaged. And through it all, she remained in the room where Jake had yelled to lock the door, hearing the chaos below. Knowing that Connor had come to drag her back. Knowing that Jake was among them, possibly being hurt or killed because of her. When she finally came downstairs after Connor was taken away, after the paramedics left, after the house returned to the eerie silence that followed the chaos, she found Jake sitting at the kitchen table, his arm bandaged, broken glass still scattered, trying to appear composed, but clearly processing his own adrenaline. "You're hurt." That wasn't a question. It was an accusation laden with guilt. "Because of me. You could have died because of me. I'm alive." Jake looked at her, saw guilt consuming her, and cut before it could solidify. "You're safe. That's what matters. The cut will heal. You. Being alive, and Connor being imprisoned, is what matters." She crossed the room, her movements trembling but determined. She cupped his face in her hands, still shivering with residual adrenaline, forcing him to look directly at her instead of dismissing his own injury. "You risked your life. For me. You could have shot me and it would have been justified. But you didn't because you didn't want me to live with this. I don't know how to thank you. How to process this. ... You don't need to know." "How?" Jake cut in gently, his hands covering hers, maintaining a touch that was an anchor for both of them. "Just accept that I did it because I wanted to. Not because it was work. Not because I was obligated to. But because you matter. To me. Personally." It was an unplanned confession, words slipping out before he could censor them, before any professional filter could intervene. And she, hearing an admission that changed everything, didn't back down. She didn't create distance. She simply held him tighter. "He made me feel that love was control," she whispered. "That jealousy was proof of how much I mattered. That violence was my fault for provoking him. But you showed me that true protection doesn't demand, doesn't control. It just gives, without expecting anything in return." And in the silence that followed, with Connor finally out of reach, imprisoned on charges that would guarantee years, not months, with evidence that no lawyer could dismiss with the future opening up for the first time in years, they both understood a truth they had avoided naming. What had begun as professional protection had transformed into something far more complicated, far more personal, infinitely more real. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific moment after trauma is resolved, when the threat is neutralized, when the danger passes, when you can finally breathe without constantly checking over your shoulder, that is paradoxically more frightening than the danger itself. Because during a crisis, you have a clear purpose: to survive. But afterward, when the dust settles, and you are safe for the first time in years, you have to confront something infinitely more complex and terrifying: who you are when you are not just surviving. And what you do with connections that were born in the fire of trauma when that fire finally goes out. For her and Jake, those days after Connor's break-in were a strange navigation through completely uncharted territory. Connor was in jail, no bail this time. The prosecution building a case with multiple serious charges that would guarantee years. Home invasion of a police officer, assault with a weapon against an officer, violation of a restraining order, stalking documented through weeks of meticulous evidence. Connor's lawyer was already negotiating a plea deal because the trial would be a massacre. Jake estimated 5 to 8 years minimum, possibly 10, if the prosecution managed to add all the charges. And for the first time since Connor showed up at the bar weeks ago, she was genuinely safe. Not temporarily, not until the next escalation, but safe in a way that allowed her to start thinking about the future measured in years, not days. It should have been pure relief, but instead, it brought confusion because the foundation upon which her connection with Jake was built had fundamentally shifted. They didn't talk about Jake's confession immediately. "You matter, personally." because there was a lot to process in the immediate aftermath. Statements to officers, photos of the scene, Jake having to explain to superiors why a witness was living in his house, an explanation that was accepted, given the circumstances, but which generated glances and murmurs about appropriate versus inappropriate. And both needed time to process their own emotions before confronting each other's emotions. But confession hung between them, changing the texture of each interaction. Dinners that had been comfortable now carried a different kind of tension, not uncomfortable, but charged with possibility, with unspoken things. Conversations that naturally drifted into the personal now paused briefly before crossing that threshold. Both aware that intimacy that was understandable during a crisis could be viewed differently now. And there was a practical question that neither of them wanted to confront, but which was unavoidable. Did she need to continue living there? The danger that justified the arrangement had passed. Connor was in prison. She could return to her apartment, resume her life, rebuild the independence she had worked so hard to establish. But neither of them mentioned it. Jake, because he had grown accustomed to her presence in ways he didn't want to examine too closely, the house feeling less empty, shared meals, conversations that made the solitude he had accepted as permanent seem like a choice rather than a destiny, and she because the idea of returning to the apartment Connor had violated, to the routines he had contaminated, to the solitude that had once been safety but now only felt like isolation, was less appealing than it should be. It was a week after the invasion when they finally confronted the elephant. She was cooking dinner pasta with a sauce she had perfected over weeks. There and Jake was helping, chopping vegetables with a precision she had come to anticipate and appreciate. A comfortable silence was broken when she spoke without looking at him. I should start looking for a new apartment. Go back to work, full-time, rebuild, normalcy. Jake stopped cutting. Should he? There's no reason to keep pressuring you. Connor is in prison. The danger has passed. You're not imposing anything. The correction was immediate. And if the danger has passed, if you're safe, why change an arrangement that's working? She finally turned, looking directly at him. Because it was built on necessity. And necessity has passed, and I don't want you to stay with me because you feel obligated to protect me. Obligation. Jake repeated the word as if testing its taste. You think that's what it is? Obligation. I don't know what it is. Brutal honesty. I know it started with you protecting me, and I'm grateful more than I can express. But I don't want gratitude confused with anything else. For either of us. Jake put down the knife, turned his whole body to face her, giving her the full attention the moment deserved. So I'm going to be clear in a way that can't be misinterpreted. It started as protection, yes. But for weeks now, it hasn't been just that. You matter to me. Not as a victim I saved. Not as a responsibility I have. As a person I... double quotes. He paused, searching for the right words. As someone who makes this house feel like home, instead of just a structure where I sleep between shifts. As someone whose laughter I long to hear. As a presence I miss on the rare days when work keeps me away for too many hours. It was a more direct confession than before, without ambiguity or room for misunderstanding. And she processed it, looking for manipulation or pressure and finding none. Just the honest truth from a man who had spent weeks proving through his actions that his words carried weight. I feel something too, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. But I'm terrified to trust it. Because Connor taught me that feelings that seem real can be a mask for control. That a man who seems protective can become possessive. That love can turn into a prison. I'm not Connor. Jake maintained a gentle but firm tone. And I never will be. But I understand you need time to believe that. You need to see through consistent actions, not just words, that the protection I offer doesn't come with strings attached. So what are you proposing? Stay, not because you're forced to, not because there's still danger, but because you want to. Because this, he gestured between them, is worth exploring when there's no life or death pressure. And if at any point you feel you're becoming controlling, that I'm crossing lines, that it's not what you want, you leave. No guilt, no drama, no trying to convince you otherwise. It was an offer that fully respected her autonomy while clearly expressing his desire. And she, in processing it, recognized a fundamental difference between that and how Connor had always operated. Connor never gave a real choice. He framed everything as us, but it meant him. Jake was offering genuine choice, accepting that the answer could be no, proving through the very structure of the offer that he understood consent and autonomy. Okay, she finally said. I'll stay, but not as a protected person, as someone exploring what this could be without pressure. Someone's taking advantage, Jake repeated, a small smile finally breaking the tension. I can live with that. And in the days that followed, the dynamic changed subtly but significantly. They were no longer protector and protected. They were two people who liked each other, who were learning about each other outside of a crisis context, who were carefully testing whether a connection born of trauma could survive and thrive in peace. Because there is a fundamental difference between a man who says he loves you and uses that as an excuse to control every aspect of your life, and a man who never utters the word love lightly, but demonstrates through every action, every choice, respecting autonomy, every moment offering presence without demanding reciprocity. Every decision putting her well-being above his ego, that her safety, peace, and autonomy matter more than possessiveness or control. Connor had screamed, "I love you," while hurting her, while isolating her, while systematically destroying the person she was. Jake never said words, but he bled, protecting her, offered her a home unconditionally, respected boundaries even when proximity made it easy to cross them. And while she processed this revelation that true love isn't intensity or jealousy or a compulsive need to possess, but respect and patience and a consistent choice to honor another person's humanity. And while Jake processed that he had crossed a definitive line between professional and personal, and that he didn't regret it, they both understood a truth that was both frightening and liberating. Rebuilding life after abuse isn't just about escaping. It's about relearning what a healthy relationship should look like. It's about distinguishing between trauma bonding and genuine connection. It's about understanding that vulnerability isn't weakness, and that trusting the right person isn't repeating the mistake of trusting the wrong person. And sometimes, the person who teaches you this is exactly the one who showed up at the right moment. Not with grand promises of salvation or dramatic declarations of eternal love, but with constant presence, unconditional protection, and infinite patience for you to heal at your own pace, to learn to trust again, to discover who you are when you're no longer just surviving. The greatest danger was no longer Connor. It was allowing fear of the past to prevent the construction of a future. It was choosing a seemingly safe solitude over a vulnerability that was risky but offered the possibility of something real. And this choice, between closure and openness, between protecting oneself and protecting each other, between old scars dictating the future and a future being written despite scars, was something they would both have to face. Not alone, but together. Share your theories in the comments. When a connection is born from trauma, how do you know if it's real or just a response to shared danger? And does it matter if you choose to continue even after the danger has passed? If you've made it this far with me, if you've felt every word of this journey of healing, protection, and rediscovery, if you've recognized something of yourself in her, struggle to distinguish between control disguised as love and protection that truly respects, then you understand why these stories matter. It's not just about romance or suspense. It's about seeing the difference between a man who uses love as an excuse to destroy and a man who demonstrates real care through consistent actions, not empty words. It's about recognizing that vulnerability with the right person is not weakness, it's courage. And look, if this kind of story resonates with you, if You want to continue exploring these healing journeys where two people find each other, not at the perfect moment, but at the necessary moment. Signing up here is the way to continue walking with me. Because I create each script thinking of you. Someone who understands that the best stories aren't those where everything is easy from the start, but those where imperfect, wounded, cautious people choose to take a risk, choose to trust again, because they've found someone who proves, day after day, that they deserve that trust. Comment below. I'm with you until the end because I want to know that you're here. That her and Jake's journey resonated with you. That you recognize the brutal difference between toxic possessiveness and true protection. Your comments tell me that it's worth investing hours, building each nuance, each moment of vulnerability, each revelation that healing is possible when you find the right person. And if this touched you in any way, you recognized Connor, and someone you knew. If you saw Jake's reflection in someone who protected you without asking for anything in return. If you understood that relearning what love should look like is a journey that takes time, but is worth every step, leave a like so I know. It's not about numbers. It's about knowing that what I create crosses the screen and touches something real in you. And because I know you don't want this story to end here, because stories like this demand a continuation, demand to see what happens when two people who met at the worst possible moment have to discover who they are to each other when the crisis passes and real life begins. There's a video over here that continues in the same vein. Click and follow along with me there. Their journey is just beginning, and so is ours. Until the next chapter.